The death toll continues to rise after Japan's deadliest earthquake ever. There is a new official number now, 574 people dead, but that number is sure to rise as hundreds of people are still said to be missing.
And meanwhile, new details just coming in about meltdown fears at one of Japan's nuclear plants damaged in Friday's 8.9 earthquake. Residents are now being warned to stay indoors after an explosion destroyed the roof and walls of the Fukushima No. 1 nuclear facility. That and another plant lost cooling ability following yesterday's destruction, and radioactivity at the plant was detected at 20 times over the normal level. Japan's Nuclear Safety Commission saying earlier that it indeed may be experiencing a meltdown. We're told several workers reported to be hurt in the explosion at that plant, including one who's trapped inside a crane. About 45,000 people who live within a 6-mile radius were reportedly evacuated earlier today, and now we're hearing that area, could be expanded, that a lot more people could be evacuated as a result of this, because we just heard from the Japanese government that there is radiation definitely leaking from this. For more on this disaster, we're joined now by nuclear expert Mark Hibbs. Hi, Mark. What can you tell us about where they are in this right now? I mean, is this a meltdown?
It certainly looks like the beginning of one. The Japanese government has warned for several hours that a meltdown was about ready to ensue. The problem that we're having right now is that we're getting very little direct information from the plant. There's a lot of speculation and contradictory reports coming out of the plant site via various Japanese news agencies. The media have been reporting, as you say, that the explosion has been attributed to an explosion blowing off the top of the reactor building. There have been other reports in Japan, somewhat less spectacular, that suggest that the explosion was a hydrogen explosion related to efforts to cool the reactor core. So we don't really have any confirmation yet of what's actually happening there. The Japanese government has said precious little about this. The utility organization that runs the plant has also said very little. So we're expecting news. My intuition is that they are struggling desperately with this, because if they had succeeded in cooling the core, we would be hearing that officially, and that we haven't heard yet.
Mark, just explain to people out there what a meltdown is. What does that mean when you say that there is a meltdown or the beginnings of a meltdown at a nuclear power plant?
Basically what that means is that the hot fuel inside the reactor is no longer being cooled by water. The water boils off. The fuel begins to heat up. There's pressure also related to the steam buildup inside the reactor core. There's a tremendous amount of heat and pressure in there, and basically what happens is that the fuel begins to melt due to the high heat. The pressure then continues, and you have the possibility that in addition to damaging the structures in the core, because the radiation, the humidity, the heat, and the pressure all conspire to destroy structures inside the reactor. The pressure, if the building is not secure and the integrity of the building is not guaranteed, then the building itself can break up, and then you'll see a significant emission of radioactive material into the atmosphere.
Obviously, 45 different countries have offered help to Japan to deal with the humanitarian effort as a result of the earthquake and the tsunami. What kind of international assistance might be useful when we're talking about the nuclear situation here?
There's precious little the outside world can really do, because when this reactor began having this loss of coolant accident yesterday afternoon, they had basically a window of several hours to perhaps a day to get the reactor under control. So the timeline on this is as follows. When the earthquake hit, the power went out of the reactor site. That shut down the reactor. There was no more critical reaction in the core. But then they had the problem where emergency cooling equipment failed because of further power supply difficulty related to the tsunami, which came in and flooded the reactor buildings. So they are without power and cooling capability. the Japanese reactor then immediately took action together with the utility to fly in their new replacement diesel generator power systems and other equipment to get cold water into that core and flush that heat out of there. That's the problem that they faced. They had basically, let's just say, give or take a few hours, about 24 hours to do that. We have seen a day gone by. We haven't heard any news. There's a lot of speculation swirling around the plant. And because we haven't heard anything specifically from the government or the utility telling us on the outside world that they have this under control, we can only assume that they're still wrestling in dire straits with this issue.
Is it possible that they can still pull this out, that maybe they're still protecting the reactor, but the fact that the Japanese government is now saying that there is a radiation leak, does that tell you that the reactor, is part of this explosion that we're looking at?
I would be very, very careful and cautious about attributing significance to radiation leaks. The radiation level in the atmosphere in the site of a nuclear reactor is basically zero, and so when even a tiny bit of radiation leaks out of there, it sounds dramatic because you are talking about 1,000 levels of 1,000 greater or 2,000% greater, but in fact the amount of radiation in that case still could be very small. The radiation really isn't the key indicator here. The indicator is what's going on inside of the core. They've got to get that cooled down. If there were a breach of the reactor building, as some people have speculated as a result of that explosion, we very well could see large amounts of radiation escaping from the core because the fuel is under great stress, and it's very possible that the radiation buildup at this point in the accident scenario is increasing.
Mark, we have time for another question or two. The fallout from a meltdown and what it would mean for Japan, especially given what they've been going through now after the earthquake and the tsunami. What are we talking about here in about 30 seconds, if you can?
Well, it would depend on how damaged the fuel is. I mean, a meltdown can be contained. It can be an entire core. So we have a whole gamut of possibilities. If it's a small amount of fuel and the meltdown is interrupted, then you'll see a significant release, but it will be limited. If a great deal of the core inventory is melted down and something happens like an explosion inside of the reactor building that would propel that material outside of the building, then we've got a serious problem. And if that were to happen, we would see something perhaps not as dramatic, but in the direction of what we saw in Chernobyl in 1986.
Mark Hibbs with the Carnegie Endowment, nuclear expert. Mark, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
And that's it for now for our coverage, but we will continue right here on Fox News Channel, the aftermath of the earthquake.